Have you ever just sat down, drew a portrait, and then once you're finished with it, you look back and you said, wow, this looks nothing like my reference image? I'm going to share in this video how I draw portraits step by step. Now, I'm not going to go into specific details on how I render skin and nose. This is just going to be the steps I take on how I get the final product to make it look like the reference image. You can do like stylized, you can do like realism. I love doing realism, and even if you do like a stylistic type of portrait, this can apply to you as well. I like to draw with pen and pencil. Those are like my main two mediums, but if you draw anything else, that's fine. When I choose my reference image, or when I take a reference image, I love to find a photo that shows enough shadow, enough contrast, so there could be more depth within the portrait itself. Now, the first thing I do, whether I'm drawing a pen or pencil, I outline my portrait in pencil. And you're probably asking, well, how do I outline? How do I get proportions right? Well, there are many different techniques you can do. You can use grid art, you can do the Loomis method, or you can freehand. But the last thing I wouldn't recommend doing, but you can do, is trace. Unless you can freehand perfectly, I recommend not tracing at all. You're probably asking, how do I get my proportions so perfect when I freehand? Well, the key is to work your way from the inside to the outside. When I first started drawing, I always outline the outside and then I work my way to the inside of the portrait. This was a big mistake because there was no way for me to measure the relationship between the different parts of the face to like the outline. So when I was done, it just didn't look right. It was so off. What I usually do is I start with the nose, the center. So I outline the nose, I outline the nostrils, and then I work my way down or work my way up. So if I work my way down, I measure how big is the nostril compared to this part before you get to the upper lip. And then I do the same thing with how big is the length of my nose compared to my reference image. And let's just say you have the eyes in, then you can measure the length of the upper eyelid to the length of the eyebrow. You can also measure from your top lip to your bottom lip to the chin. There are so many different ways you can do it, but that's just pretty much how I do it. I just freehand it. I just look at the relationship between the different parts of the face and then I draw it in. I don't want you guys to get too carried away thinking you have to measure with your eyes or do everything with your eyes. That is simply not true. It's better to use materials when you're first starting off. For example, look at my face, okay? I know I have a big forehead. So if I take my forehead and I measure the length of my forehead compared to my upper nose, it stops at my upper lip. And that's how you can measure your reference image to your drawing. You can use a ruler, you can use a pencil, you can use any tool that will help you with your measurements. Now, once I have my measurements in place, I outline all of the shapes, like from shadows to highlights to just weird looking things. Like I measure it all. Just looking at the measurements, I know it just does not make sense. Like all the different shapes I outline, it's just too much, right? But the thing about portraits, and I tell people all the time, portraits are just shapes. At the end of the day, everything that makes up a face, or not just a face, like anything else, they're just shapes at the end of the day. So if you can get down the shapes, then you're set. Once I have my measurements right, once I have all the shapes in, I start with the shadows. And with shadows, I always start with the darkest part of the portrait. I treat my drawings like I treat painting. If you know anything about oil painting, then you work from dark to light. And that's basically what I do. I always start with the darkest part of the face. That's usually in the nostrils, that's usually the eye, the eyebrow. It could be like some parts of the ear. It could also be the hair. It's really whatever you choose to start with. The reason why I always start with the darkest part is so I can have a reference for the values. Like I said, I measure everything with my eyes. I don't use a value scale to compare it to the portrait. You can, because it would definitely help you out with your values. But what I do is, so I always use the darkest part to measure how dark or how light a value should be within a different part of the portrait itself. When I do portraits, it's really funny. Say I'm working on a nose. I don't sit there and finish the whole entire nose and then move on to the eye, then finish the whole entire eye, then move on to the cheek. I always jump from one spot to another. I might work on the darkest areas of the nose and then move to the darkest area of the eye, and then maybe move on to the darkest area of the lips. Like I like to jump from one part to the other. That way I can get everything down on the paper. So when I'm working with pencil, I try to get as much graphite on the paper as possible. And when I'm working with pen, I try to get as much ink on the paper as possible. I just don't like seeing too much white within a portrait because it's kind of distracting for me, and I need to see the depth in the shadows when I'm working on the portrait to help me, render the portrait a lot better. And you should also treat your portraits like you're sculpting something like sculpting a face out of clay. I know it's two-dimensional, and at first it's probably like, okay, well, I just see this paper, I see this portrait I'm drawing in a two-dimensional plane. Once you actually start to see it in a three-dimensional plane and imagine that you're like kind of sculpting it with your pencil or your tool, it becomes a lot easier to create. In my opinion, there are two main things that make a portrait look amazing. That's proportions, and that's also lighting. If you don't study proportions, if you don't study lighting, then you're doing yourself a huge disservice. You need to study these things in order to create amazing looking portraits. And yes, there's other stuff to study, like of course anatomy, understand why the face is the way it is, why the muscle groups are the way they are. But you know, it's important to know lighting and also proportions. Once I have all the dark values down within the shadows, I start to transition. I transition those dark values to the lighter values. And once I have more of the mid-tone filled in of the portrait, I take my pen, I take my pencil, I just scribble, crosshatch, hatch on top of the whole entire portrait so I can have an even mid-tone, but still see the shadows and still see the highlights. Once I get to this point, I barely touch the highlights. Like I don't leave them completely white, but I might add in a couple of layers to the highlight just to give it, you know, a natural look instead of just making it super bright. Now, once I have everything down, my values are nice and neat, my highlights look good, I focus on detail. Highlights within the eyebrow might be highlights within the beard, whatever. I focus on the small details like the glare in the eye. It could be little moles or bumps. Detail work is so underrated. Many artists, they show me their portraits and it looks good. Like I've seen amazing portraits. One thing to elevate your portraits are the small details, but it will make a big difference with the portrait as a whole. Drawing portraits is definitely a mindset shift because you have to break down the portrait in different parts into like shapes instead of just looking at the portrait as a whole. I want you to become amazing at drawing portraits, but trust me, it does not come overnight. It takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do it really fast. It just means that you're gonna have to put in extra work. Later down the road, I will be making different videos on how I render my portraits, like going more into detail. But in this video, I just want to share like the steps I take to draw my portraits, and maybe it will help you. You know, you can implement these same things into your drawings. The thing that I see a lot of artists struggle with is not experimenting. You have to experiment with different techniques, different styles. If you're used to doing like grid art, try doing the Loomis method. If you're used to doing Loomis method, try doing freehand. You never know what you can accomplish. And remember, whatever you start off with, your first time doing it, it's not gonna be perfect. You have to keep putting in the work, keep trying it over and over and over. We all start somewhere. We all drew stick figures at one point. You know, I was in your shoes before. So you can definitely do it. And I 100% believe in you. But most importantly, you have to believe in yourself as an artist. I hope you enjoyed this video because I really enjoy making it and sharing my knowledge with all of you. I just want you to become a better artist. I'm a self-taught artist. I didn't really have anyone help me to become a better artist. I mean, yes, I had art teachers, I had different stuff, but when it comes to working with pen, I didn't have anyone. So I just winged it. I started by cross hatching with a ballpoint pen, and I started to hatch, and I started to use a scribbling technique, then a stippling technique. So many different things I learned within my 5 years of just honing in on drawing with a ballpoint pen. If you want to learn how to draw with a ballpoint pen and know all the information that I was missing, check out my ebook on the secrets of drawing with a ballpoint pen. It gives you everything from what techniques to use, where to even get the pen, where to get the paper, how to transition, how to layer. It has everything in there that you need to start off with drawing with a ballpoint pen. The link is down in the description. I really appreciate you watching this video. Please like and subscribe, and I have so much more content on the way.